So I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you about the stone-curlew. It is a fantastic bird. I don't know if I prefer peregrines or stone-curlews, but I like them probably as much as each other. So we're going to be talking about saving the stone-curlew because it's a bird that got into some trouble over the last century, and this is how we've managed to get the numbers back up. Myself being a long-standing volunteer within the RSPB Stone-curlew project. Quick advert though, some of you may know that this book came out, Where to Watch Birds in Dorset, Hampshire and the Isle of Wight, in the 1980s. It was actually brought out by a couple of friends in Dorset, George Green in particular, and Martin Cade. And I was asked if I would actually refresh it for the 5th version, and there it is. And I've brought some copies tonight. It's £25 from Bloomsbury, or you can get it from me tonight for 20. And I'd happily, well, they're all signed anyway, so you can have a signed copy. So there's the advert. Next, please. So there are worldwide quite a few of these stone-curlew type birds. Now they're called thick-knees worldwide. That's the general term used for them. Ours is called the Eurasian thick-knee normally, although on this map it's called the stone-curlew. They all are pretty similar. They have long legs, they have large eyes, they have a yellow eye and yellow legs. And in this particular case they're all facing left, so that's quite helpful. Let's have a look at them all and talk about really how they fit in. So next slide. So here's ours, the Eurasian thick-knee. They're called thick-knees because they do have thicker knees than other wading birds, as you can see there. But that's the one that we call the stone-curlew, but it's been given many names over the years. Goggle-eyed plover was a name it was given in Victorian times, and the Wailing Heath chicken it was called at about the same time too. So let's have a look at the distribution of the stone-curlew, and you can see this is a migratory species. So the area in brown, or orange really, is the area where the bird is present only in the winter. The bits that are in blue, which you can just see there in the northern part of Africa going south, that's where they are in the winter. And the purple areas are areas where they're actually resident. So for example, in Spain, they are resident as a breeding bird, yet the ones we have are migratory and only with us from, say, end of February, early March through to November. So it's only one of the group that's actually migratory. Next slide, please. Shows us the water thick-knee. So if you've been to Africa, one of the stone-curlew type birds that you'll see, particularly in wet areas, is the water thick-knee. And it is quite a similar looking bird, isn't it, to ours. Have a look at the next slide and you'll see they're very often found here in wet areas, and they really are just like our stone-curlew to look at. If one of these turned up in Hampshire, I would think it was a stone-curlew. I'm sure you would too. The next slide shows us the distribution of the water thick-knee, an African species only, and you can see it's found right through to southern Africa from the southern parts of West Africa. So quite a wide distribution, anywhere where it's a bit damp really. They don't go for dry habitats. Next slide please. So another look-alike, the Senegal thick-knee. In fact, if anything, more like the stone-curlew than any other. And this one I have seen alongside stone-curlew in Senegal, which was quite a surprise. But they're not just found in Senegal, despite the name. Next slide will show you that in flight they're absolutely just like the bird that we see on the heaths in Hampshire and Wiltshire and also in Norfolk with the white on the wings. But they are a different bird from the stone-curlew, even though they look the same. The next slide shows you their distribution. It's a more restricted distribution. Of course, they're in Senegal, which is over here, but they are spread right the way across Africa at one level, but they don't go further south. And they're called the Senegal thick-knee because the first one to be described, I believe, was found in Senegal. The next one is a lovely looking bird. This is a spotted thick-knee with this really marbled plumage. It prefers much drier habitats in Africa. And the next slide will show you that in flight. Again, the white on the wings, very similar to the bird that we have here in Britain. Long legs jutting out the back, black and yellow eye, they're all like this. And the distribution map of that one shows you again, it's a bit of a mixture of the others. So it's again from the west side of Africa down through the east to the south. Particularly preferring drier habitats. You can see them often in dry, sort of desert-like habitats. Now the Indian thickney, again, is a real look-alike with the stone-curlew that we have. Whereas our bird is really timid, won't allow you to get anywhere near it, this is one that will be right by the roadside. And if you look at the situation, you could be driving around in India or Sri Lanka and suddenly come across a little group of the Indian thickney right by the roadside. You can actually stop your car, open the window and take a photograph of a bird 5 feet the other side. It's quite a surprise. The distribution map shows you there that it's India, Sri Lanka, but also further east into parts of Southeast Asia. Now moving over to South America, we get the double-striped thickney, which I think is one of the most elegant thickneys in the world. Very long-necked, very tall, and a lovely sort of black cap. But look, it's got the same black and yellow beak, it's got the black and yellow eye, and the long legs. So they're all so similar when you really think about it. So that one, a distribution of, here's a shot of some birds out and about. They're in the grasslands of South America, Central America too, and they are very often in family groups like this. Quite approachable too. I didn't have any difficulty in getting this photograph. And to look at the map, you'll see the distribution. Oh, there's it flying again. Here we have distribution, so Central America through to, for example, the northern parts of South America, so top end of Colombia, Venezuela, Guyana, and so on, and of course up there in the Dominican Republic and Haiti. So yeah, that's a bird that's quite easy to see. And here's another South American one, the Peruvian thickney. The name suggests it's going to be in Peru, and indeed it is. It's a very sort of fluffy thickney. If ever there was a thickney that was looking a bit like a teddy bear, this is the one. It's really soft and cuddly to look at. Again, quite easy to see. I've seen this nesting in a car park at a supermarket. But its distribution is quite restricted, and it is, so there's a group of them in the desert. If you've been to Peru, the deserts go right down to the coast. So if you go to somewhere like Lima, you'll be very close to the deserts. You go out there and you'll see them in groups. And here's the coastal strip. So the sea on this side, Peru here, and you can see they hug the coastline because of the desert, not because they want to be near the coast. It's because of the dry desert. Over to Australia. And if you've been to somewhere like Cairns in Queensland, then this bird, the bush thickney, is a very easy bird to see. It's a sort of garden bird for people in places like Cairns. Very approachable, easy to get to see, and they stand around in groups all the time when they're displaying, or indeed if they've got a family group. And they nest in gardens. So here's a bird in a garden actually putting up a threat display because it's been disturbed near its nest. It's actually in someone's garden, a friend of mine. So that's a bird that's found right around Australia. Obviously not too much in the desert areas. It likes to be in towns and small villages, not going to be in cities, but you can see quite widespread. Much more difficult to find though is this one. As the name suggests, it's not in the bush, it's on the beach. The beach thickney with a massive great beak like that. Again, black and yellow beak, black and yellow eye, yellow legs and a thickney. And there it is in flight. Doesn't look like it should fly, but it does. And it's a huge bird, actually, by comparison to some of the others. The distribution of that, well, you'll find it through much of Southeast Asia, so, you know, Malaysia, bits of Thailand, down into Indonesia, Philippines, bits of New Guinea, and, of course, the northern parts of Australia as well. And the great thickney, which is the largest of them all, I first saw this one in Iran in 2001. Again, huge beak, black and yellow eye, yellow legs, thick knees. It's a bit of a pattern, isn't it? And that one, when it flies around as well, has huge big white patches on the wing. So they're really, really similar species, all of them, in so many ways. And this one you'll find particularly on beaches. The next shot shows you a group on a pebbly beach in Indonesia. So, and the distribution there you can see bits of India and also through, I saw it in the far west in Iran, but also into Southeast Asia as well. So let's go back to the one that we know. Quick show of hands, who's seen a stone-curlew? Great, good. We'll have to get you onto a stone-curlew. Come down and see him in Hampshire. So Eurasian thick-knee, sometimes called Eurasian stone-curlew. I just call it the stone-curlew. But as I mentioned, it's got more names. So if we could have the next slide, you'll see wailing heath chicken, because it makes a wailing sound, not unlike a curlew that we see on the coast. And there are a couple doing their display when they put their head down like this, and they make a lot of noise, particularly in the evening, early morning. They don't call very much during the day. Very much a crepuscular bird, enjoying the times when the sun's going down. And they make a lot of noise when they're actually first arrived, setting up territories. Also, of course, very noisy when they are in any way anxious about their chicks. At all other times, they're quiet. So they can be quite hard to locate unless they're actually breeding. And I'm rather pleased that we've got them on one of our recent British stamps. I think that's a pretty good picture of a stone-curlew. It even has the light brown on the undertail coverts. The male, when he's displaying, sticks that tail up, and you can see that brown very, very clearly indeed. Nice picture. So a few facts and figures about our bird, the stone-curlew. The length, 42 centimetres long. If you spread it out, the wings will be 80 centimetres in width. The weight, 430 to 500 grams, so not a lot of variation there. They breed quickly. They'll breed in their first year when they come back. And they don't always, by the way, come back to where they were born. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they, if anything, go further west. So, for example, birds in Hampshire quite often end up nesting in Wiltshire in their first years. They nest in April and July. And one of the things I think is fascinating is that in places like Spain, they only nest once. They have one brood. And that's probably because it's dry and hot, and they maybe couldn't find enough food, insects, for the second brood. But in Britain, they'll breed twice. And then the clutch is always either 1 or 2 eggs. We don't ever have any more than that. Incubation, 27 days. The chick, well, the time in the nest, something like 4 to 6 hours, that's all. And then they're out of the nest and moving around. And I've actually had birds in the first hour out of the nest covering best part of 50 feet, you know, crawling along on little legs. And if they get the chance, they can live quite a long time. The longest, oldest bird we know of is 22 years old. And there's a bird on, kind of on its knees really. They very often drop down to avoid being seen. They're very, very cautious, particularly when they may be near to predators, and there are a lot more predators for them now. Kites and buzzards are at all-time high numbers in Hampshire. And in many places there are lots of mammalian predators like foxes now, where maybe there were only a few before. And I actually, on one of the sites I work on, I work across about 15 sites with some colleagues. We have a drinking pool on one of them, and all the stone-curlews from nearby come into that drinking pool. They don't find water very easily, and so they're very happy to just come into that pool, and even though it's quite close to a nesting territory, everybody just forgets that and they enjoy getting a drink. There's one in flight. It's quite a big bird in flight, quite large, like a crow size, and with the white on the wing, very obvious bird to see when it's flying around, although most of the time they're on the ground and they're really, really hard to see because they're the same color as the ground, and they always crouch down if they think there's some sort of danger. Here we've got a group of 3. Hard to tell what age these are. I think these are probably all adults, but I'm not quite sure. But they do fly around in groups, particularly in the autumn. We get autumn flocks, and this year I think we got up to 74 in our local flock in Hampshire. This is a shot of a bird coming into land, showing off those under tail coverts beautifully there. Super looking bird. And you can see it's gleaming white on the underside, and I'll show you later why that's maybe not the best thing, because we had a stone-curlew brought down by a peregrine a few years ago in Hampshire. And as peregrine's my other favourite bird, it was a bit of a bad day really. Didn't know who I should be supporting on this occasion. Anyway, just to remind you, if you remember all those other maps, this is the only one to be migratory. So our birds with us in the summer only, and then moving down through towards Africa, probably most of them I suspect spending their winter in Spain. We've not done any satellite tracking on them. I think that's an opportunity to look at in the future if we can ever get an adult bird to stick some tracking equipment on. If you look at the BTO recoveries though, these are all the recoveries of birds ringed in Britain, and you can see a big concentration down in France and also into Spain and into Morocco. The French ones, I guess, were seen because they were on migration. They were just resting up. They don't winter there. They just simply pass through. And because these birds have all got colour rings on, it's very easy to get recovery information. But look, a couple, just to go back there briefly, if you can just hop back one slide. Just a couple of records here. This one's actually in Ghana. So who knows? I would imagine there are going to be birds in this area, but not very many people live in this area, and so therefore we don't have any data. But I'm sure the map is going to be more densely populated than that if we actually knew the truth. Thank you. And here are some colour rings on a stone-curlew, but very sadly it's not in great shape, is it? So that enabled us to say that this bird was colour ringed actually about 10 years ago in Suffolk, where it was born, and it's been breeding in Suffolk ever since. But it met this rather splendid female peregrine, a young female peregrine, and I think this is probably actually one from Scandinavia, because it's a huge peregrine. I mean, females are always big, but this is very big. And you can see here we've got a woodcock that's already been dropped down. There's another woodcock just here somewhere, and of course the stone-curlew as well. So yeah, that female peregrine was very, very good at catching these waders, and I imagine as they flew over Southampton, they were lit up by the lights either at Southampton Port, where there is 24-hour activity and it's always very bright, or maybe just over the city itself, because it's very, very bright lit city, and they all have pale underwings. Anyway, there we go. Gilbert White knew all about stone-curlews. He wrote here, "I wonder that the stone-curlew should be mentioned by the writers as a rare bird. It abounds in all campaign parts of Hampshire and Sussex, and breeds, I think, all summer." So he knew stone-curlews in Hampshire. Maybe other people were not finding them, but they were at that time living on the downs. And indeed the distribution, if you look at the next slide, an old picture of stone-curlew. In 1900 they were found as far north as in Yorkshire. So even as far north as, for example, near Betton Cliffs, Flamborough, those sorts of areas. They had a wide distribution. The population back about 1900 was thought to be somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 pairs, which is pretty high. They also were kept by Victorians, and the reason for that is that the yellow eye of the stone-curlew was thought to have healing powers, that if you actually looked into the eye of a stone-curlew and you had jaundice, you were going to be cured. And so therefore they were kept by people, and people made money out of it too. They'd say, "Come and meet my stone-curlew," and they'd show them the stone-curlew. "Yes, you're cured now." Thankfully they don't do that anymore. But they were kept indoors. They weren't kept outside. They were kept indoors, and they were fed on pork and bread. And apparently they were very, very good in the house. They were quite well trained. I've read about this, and apparently they would actually they would like some people and not like others. A bit like, you know, a dog might not like a certain person, always react badly when that person arrives. Same thing with the stone-curlew. Anyway, and here we have some There are lots and lots of glass cases with, you know, stuffed stone-curlews in museums up and down the eastern side of England. So we know that these birds were definitely around in the old days. So if we go back to 1975, I went here, and I'm sure some of you will have done, Weeting Heath in Norfolk. It's the place I went to see stone-curlew for the very first time in the 1970s. And it's a Norfolk Wildlife Trust reserve. And if you go out there, you're going to see stone-curlews oops, we've gone a little bit far. Let's go back a bit. You will see, you need to go back to, no, back, you're going forwards. There we go, that's it. You will find stone-curlews on downland. And for much of the last 100 years, the early part of the last century, that is where stone-curlews wanted to be. They wanted to be on downland with rabbits grazing the grass, so it was nice and low. Plus, if you've got rabbit warrens, you've got bits of bare ground where the rabbits have been excavating. There were loads of rabbit warrens in Hampshire and Wiltshire. Unfortunately, the rabbit population is nowhere near as high now, so quite a lot of places like this, the grass is now too long for stone-curlews. If they try and nest in this habitat, they actually find themselves surrounded by long grass, and they're not comfortable with that. So quite a lot of them moved into places like, for example, Salisbury Plain. A good area because not many people wandering around on Salisbury Plain. I know the people who are wandering around are firing guns and things, but it's not a bad place to be. And there's a good population on Salisbury Plain. So they moved off downs onto places like Salisbury Plain. They also moved on to farms in a number of places, and the whole sort of distribution of stone-curlews now sort of focused around farmland rather than downland. But they're not really designed to be near to farms, because if you think about it, they hide their nests and they hide their chicks. And therefore, when tractors come onto the land, it's very hard for the farmer to know where stone-curlews are and to avoid actually killing the birds. So this is why the RSPB got very much involved in this in the late 1980s, because the population was really declining. So if we go back to those days, the early days when I was a kid, here we have the distribution. So it's very much like a map of the chalk in southern England. You can see Norfolk and Suffolk, east coast of Suffolk too. Some in Oxfordshire, Berkshire, Hampshire, Wiltshire, and even quite a few in Sussex. And some of you may even remember the days when they nested at Dungeness. So yes, they were quite widespread, but numbers were declining. If we move forward, you'll see that the most recent BTO atlas shows a different distribution, similar, but you know, they've almost gone from Sussex, they've gone from Kent, they're in Norfolk and Suffolk, but a more restricted range, and similarly, they're in the sort of Wessex area of Wiltshire and Hampshire, but a more restricted area. And if you now look at the change map between those two, here's what you've got. So it's amber listed now. You've got black triangles all over the place. These are places where the bird ceased to breed, and you've got upright red triangles where the bird moved into. Now you might think, given the number of black triangles, that this bird is on the way out. But actually what happened is the ones that remained nested in higher densities than ever before, and actually in that time we've managed to treble the population of stone-curlews in an area maybe only a third that they had before. So it's a really good project they were doing. Okay, I don't know why I've got that in. I gave a lecture last week in Berkshire, so that's why I've put that in. There's the Berkshire stone-curlew numbers, sorry about that. Here's Hampshire, where I'm working, and to give you an idea, top right is sort of Fleet, Basingstoke, Portsmouth down here, Southampton here, you've got the Avon Valley. So they basically are now nesting very much up in the northwestern part of Hampshire and towards the border with Wiltshire. And we've centrally blocked those because we don't want to give away too much information as to where they are. But good numbers there. But let's have a look at the change map, which just goes to show what I said earlier about how the area of distribution had really gone down in size. All the red areas here, and again they're centrally plotted, are places where they've gone from. So you can see, lost from 40 squares in Hampshire and gained in only 15. And there were 16 where they stayed throughout. Well, you can see the big growth is up there in the north. And that's where we made lots of effort to try and create stone-curlew habitat. And that's really what I'm going to tell you about. There's also a few that appear to be hanging around very late. Actually, I think they're going to be wintering in Britain before long because the climate is kind enough that they don't feel the need to migrate anymore. So there's the chart from the bird track. Gives you an idea from January through to December on the right. You can see they're arriving very much in March. They're all in by April really. You've got a peak of activity in May, that's when the first brood is appearing. And then you've got a second peak of activity in July, and that's probably to tie in with the second brood. And then they disappear sometime during October and November. Now, last autumn, we actually had our final bird in Hampshire on the 15th of November, and this spring we had our first bird on the 17th of February. So they're only away for a very short time, just 13 weeks. Hampshire I love, as Phil mentioned, I'm not the county recorder now, I actually just stood down, but I was for 15 years county recorder and I'm chair of Hampshire Ornithological Society. 70% of southern England and Hampshire is farmland, and some of it is beautiful, looks like this. Some of it, I'm afraid, is not. So we're really concentrating on areas like this where we can talk to farmers and see if we can persuade them to work with stone-curlews. The downland areas, I'm afraid, we've just lost them. You know, they're either now farms or they're full of people, because people like walking and they like being out in the countryside, and we encourage them to do that, don't we? So you've got to work with the farmers, and that's what we're doing. So what we do is we find places where we think stone-curlews could potentially nest, or maybe where they've been showing up and the farmer's told us he's seeing them and we think it's a good chance of getting them to breed, and we do a survey. And we try and find an area which can give us a 2-hectare area of open ground. And the next slide shows you a typical plot that we will create for stone-curlews. The farmer gets paid for this, around about £800 or £900. And this is 1 hectare on this side, a bit of a grass buffer, and another hectare on that side. And the idea of getting 2 halves and getting it ready in March is that when the birds arrive, they can come in, they can maybe land on the left-hand side and nest, and then whilst we know they're nesting on the left-hand side, we can go on the right-hand side with the tractor and just cultivate the land again, turn over the soil nice and fine. Because if they fail, because they maybe get their eggs taken or their chicks die early on, if the left-hand side isn't in great condition anymore, maybe too many plants, the right-hand side will be perfect. And anyway, for the second brood, we want the other half to be perfect for them. So it's a good way of doing it. And of course, if you don't prepare the plot for the second brood, then you end up in a situation like this. And if we just zoom in with the next slide, these poor stone-curlews, there they are, put a little circle around them. I think they're thinking, you know, is this a really good place to nest or not? Because, you know, it's quite nice down here, but a lot of it is overgrown. And if a fox wants to come in, they are going to have less time to react. And they're more interested in saving themselves than saving their eggs. They can lay more eggs. So they're not keen on getting killed. And so they might not nest on there. So that's why we need those plots prepared a second time for the second brood. This is a typical plot. So fine stony ground, finely turned over. So you don't want to have, for example, great big, you know, dips in the ploughed field, because that's not good. They then can't see what's going on, or they get flooded because the water goes into little channels. You want it lightly turned over. And you also want to have, on the next slide there, a buffer strip if possible in the middle. And that's really great because stone-curlews can go and hide in that. The babies can go in here and hide. And it means the parents can go and find food and bring the food to the birds, the baby birds. Lapwings, for example, totally different strategy. They have maybe 4 chicks and they all go wandering around. They feed themselves and they end up getting killed. If you've got lots of kites and buzzards, lapwings don't really stand much of a chance unless there's several pairs. Stone-curlews, however, managed to hide them well. So the display will be in April. This bird on the left I ringed with colour rings, I think in 2019, and the great thing was that it came back in 2020 and actually nested in the field where it was born. And there was also another pair of stone-curlews nesting in that field, and they tolerated that bird completely. There was no antagonism that I could see, and I can only think that because perhaps that was their son, I know it was a male from watching him, maybe they just decided that, you know, keep the family in, two members of the same family in the same field. Can't be too sure because they weren't ringed, but you know, does show you the value of ringing there, Phil. So there we are, display, and then they'll be looking for a nest. So what they do is they go around on areas like this, they will pick up tiny, tiny stones and they will make a nest. And I'll show you a photo of the nest in a minute. Here's a couple, one on the nest, one standing guard. Quite often the one standing guard will be quite a long way off. They don't necessarily stand together like this. They change over at the nest about once every hour, hour and a half. They both have a brood patch. On some species, of course, the brood patch is on the female, but this they both have a brood patch, and they do equal share of looking after the eggs. And that's very good, because if I'm watching a stone-curlew standing on guard somewhere in a field, I probably can't see the bird on the nest. So I've only got to wait an hour to an hour and a half before that bird then relieves the other bird and actually just walks up to the bird on the nest, gives it a poke on the back, it will stand up, move on, the other one moves in, so it makes life a lot easier. A little bit of video here, hopefully will play if we just, probably if you just do the next slide, it'll just go automatically into play. Here we go. So stone-curlew coming in, watch how it sits down. Okay, so that's sitting down on the nest. I don't know if you can play that again. I don't know if it's possible to go backspace and then try it once more. And I just want you to watch how that bird settles down, if we can do it. Let's just try it again, because it's a very distinctive way. They don't just plonk down. So here we go. It's coming in from over here. Eggs are here. And watch how it does it. It does a little shimmy. Very slow. If that bird was just going to sit down, it would plonk down. It wouldn't do that little shimmy. And that's something I always look for to try and make sure I know they're nesting. Here are the eggs. Now one thing they do is they collect these small stones and they make a platform of stones onto which they put the eggs. And the reason they want to do that, I think, is to keep the eggs off this mud, because if it rained, they might have a risk of the eggs getting attached to the mud and maybe wouldn't hatch. So that's a good photograph of the nest as it would be. Now, as I mentioned, 1 to 2 eggs. We did actually know of a case where there were 4 eggs. There were 2 females that both share the nest, and it was just too many eggs in the nest. They couldn't cover them, so none of them hatched. And as I said, 2 broods in Britain, but where they are resident, such as in Spain, just the 1 brood. So we mark the nests when we find them. Now, in the old days, we used to use these rather nice canes, or maybe a bit of bamboo. We thought that was a great idea. Put one of those 5 meters each side of the nest, because that would be helpful for the farmer, and indeed I'd be able to find them again as well if I was looking. But then we worked out that actually carrion crows are very clever. They know that if there are 2 sticks in the ground, then in the middle there's going to be a nice set of eggs to eat. So we stopped doing that, and now we have other ways of doing it, involving stones and things like that on the edge of the field. But you basically are marking the nest, and you're looking for a nest like this. So here we are, here's the eggs. It's important to mark the nest in some cases, because although we have lots of farmers who are giving over these plots for these birds, they don't always nest on plots. Sometimes they nest on an ordinary field like this, which is being used. So we need to get the farmer on side, and we need to have a way of marking the nests. And here's an example. Here are the eggs, and here's a tractor coming through. Well, those tractor tyres are going to go over those eggs. This farmer is not in the scheme, not being paid for this, so there's no reason why he should change what he's doing. But I have to say, most farmers are absolutely delighted to find out they've got stone-curlews. They almost find it's a bit of a tick in the box that they've got stone-curlews and their neighbours haven't. But if they did decide not to cooperate, I'm entitled under my licence to pick up these eggs. I'd take a photograph of them first, let the farmer go through, and then I'd put the eggs back in exactly the same position so that there's, it's identical to the birds. So that's an important way of actually making sure that they have an extra chance of succeeding. Now the second thing we do is when we're looking at eggs is we measure them. I did a piece on Spring Watch with Chris Packham a couple of years ago where we demonstrated this. So I go up, I get the egg, I measure the egg in both ways so that I know what the volume of the egg is, and I weigh the egg. Now if I know the volume of the egg and I know the weight and I check it again and again, I can actually work out how many days it is until the egg is going to hatch. Because as the chick grows inside the egg, the weight of the egg will decrease because the chick is using up all the yolk, and the chick may be growing, but it still weighs less than what the egg weighed initially. So I'm able to say to the farmer, you've got 5 days until this chick is going to come out. So for 5 days you can run around with your tractor without too many worries, as long as you don't go too close. But after 5 days there could be a small chick, or 2 small chicks, and we'll need to be really careful. And if they've got to do farming operations, then what happens is I come in with some colleagues, we go in early, we find the chicks, we take them off the field, keep them warm, and then we ask the farmer to come in and do what they've got to do, and then as soon as that's done, we take the chicks back out. So again, another opportunity to really increase the survival rate of the chicks. And here are a couple of chicks just down there. There's no way the farmer's going to spot the chicks. The birds, the adult birds, they don't, for example, stand in front of the tractor feigning wing broken or anything like that. They actually fly off the field immediately, they make a couple of calls and they're gone. And the chicks remain totally still. They're so confident in their camouflage that they know they can't be found. And I know how hard they are to find because I've actually ringed them, put them down on the field next to me. I've then turned around, walked 6 paces and thought, oh hang on, better just make sure I did put the ring up the right way. Gone back and I can't find them. They're so well camouflaged. I now use a thermal imager. So there you've got the farmer looking at the chicks on the ground. Stone-curlews themselves are brilliant parents, as I mentioned. Here's one being very, very alert. Quite a few of the farms we've got lots of red kites and buzzards. And one of the things I think we will consider in the future is doing diversionary feeding of those kites particularly. Putting out day-old chicks from farms so that the red kites get all the food they need to feed their chicks from that source, and they don't go out and hassle the lapwings and the stone-curlews. And here's one just crouching down a bit. They're always nervous. You can watch them, they can see kites from a long, long way away. And one of the things I've noticed is they won't feed their chicks if there are kites above them. They'll wait until the kite flies off, they'll keep the prey they've got, and then they'll go over to the chick. They're very good parents. Here's a sheep showing a bit too much interest. And sheep will eat both lapwing eggs and stone-curlew eggs, and they'll eat curlew eggs too. They eat eggs. They love them. So get rid of them. I don't think rabbits are a problem, but here's an example of a stone-curlew getting rid of a rabbit. Female on the nest, I think, and the male getting a bit aggressive. So if it all goes well, we're going to have chicks like this. And here's one. The other one is underneath this bird here, being brooded. It was a cold day. I was actually on a lavender farm on one of our study plots. Next shot shows you an adult with a chick, and you can see already at about a week old, this chick is looking like the parents straight away. In fact, they look like the parents on day one, but it starts to look like a stone-curlew. It's got all the markings, it's really well camouflaged. And as they grow up a bit, they get a little bit bigger, and that's the sort of age you want to start thinking about ringing them, at the point where they are maybe 3 weeks old. We have to be at least 100 grams in weight before we start to ring them. And here's an adult with a couple of chicks. So you can see by this stage, about 5 weeks old, these are now looking very much like the parents. The only difference is they don't yet fly. They could probably fly 20 yards, but they're in that sort of mood where they don't know whether to fly or whether to try and hide, so they usually do a bit of both. And here they are. Here's a chick on the ground. This is the typical sort of, you know, I can't see you, you can't see me sort of thing. And basically, that's the way I find them when I'm going to ring them. So, quick question for Phil. How many people does it take to ring a stone-curlew chick?
Oh, no more than one.
Well,
You could find it.
doesn't say much for my ringing abilities, because the next slide shows you that here I am putting plastic rings on a stone-curlew chick. I've got Janice, my co-worker, keeping the chick calm. I've got Barry with the glue or the solvent for the rings. We've got the farmer over here, just off shot, who's very proud, taking photographs of it, and then I've got another friend taking a photograph of all of that. So the answer is need 5 people. Yeah, and same. I'm not that good a ringer. As you can see, they are absolutely gorgeous. So I think one of the most important moments I find, and we don't do the ringing now because we've run out of colour combinations, so we may or may not start again. But one of the nicest things is to show a farmer a stone-curlew chick that we've managed to rear on his or her farm, and the whole family come out and you sort of pass it around so they can all have a look. And that's the point where you see that they absolutely are determined to make it work the next year. We want 0.6 of a chick to be born per pair per year. And I believe, although we can't always prove it because they hide well, that we're outperforming that number, so the population is increasing. Obviously we take measurements. The RSPB are very keen on bill measurements as well. This is where Phil's going to comment on my ringing technique. So the next shot is, here we go, just putting these colour rings on, and they are held together with solvent, and they're very useful because in the future when you're seeing flocks, autumn flocks, you can see the adults with their chicks and you can get some sort of idea of survival. And the next photo shows you the kind of colour combinations we have, always 3 colours. I actually had the last of the ring, the combinations. It was grey, grey and grey. Nobody wanted to ring a bird with grey, grey and grey. Everybody said it's never going to be seen again. And actually it was the next year. So that was the last one we did. Here's an example of a bird. Obviously some of these rings have fallen off. It's still got a white one, it's got a red one. That bird kept coming back to the same plot every year. Its partner wasn't ringed. But it did enable us to work out whether there is some site fidelity for breeding stone-curlews. And if you get it all right, then you get these lovely chicks growing up well alongside the farm. We do get occasions though when they go into crop in the next door farm. So you might have, for example, a stone-curlew plot, but next to it a field of rape, and in August they're in the rape, hiding sensibly, keeping away from all the kites. But the farmer's not part of the scheme, so he's got to cut his rape. So he's going to harvest his rape with a combine harvester, and I'm there with a walkie-talkie telling him, you know, go slowly. And we get in from the one end of the field and, you know, zigzag right the way along to where the stone-curlew chicks are hiding. I can't get to them. You know, they'll run if I go into the rape anyway. Might run further in. And we wait for the combine harvester to get just to the point where we can, you know, it's getting a bit noisy for them, and they run out, and then 3 of us run into the field and grab them and put them in the back of my car. The next photo shows you a couple of stone-curlew chicks just relaxing in my car whilst the farming operation finishes. And you get a little thank you note from them at the end. Here's an example, next photo, of a little thank you note from the stone-curlew chick. I don't really know why, but stone-curlew droppings are incredibly smelly, and they're mainly eating worms, but I tell you now, it's bad. So yeah, if it has gone well, here we have the adult at the back, very, very bright plumage, the young ones, a little bit puffy-faced at the front, you can actually tell when you've got young birds. Although if you just had one on its own, you might have to think a bit. But when you get them mixed in with adults, you can work out who's who. And this next shot is a lovely one. This is actually from this autumn, or this summer. That's a hawk moth, isn't it? And that's a young chick that just found that and is thinking about eating it. We have, as I said, autumn flocks. 74 was the total in our local flock. So although we know of about 15 pairs that we're helping, there must be others nesting that we don't yet know about, which is great. So there's 74 in the autumn flock this year, mixed in occasionally with lapwings. And if we look at the graph, this is the situation. Left-hand end, 1992, when the project was just starting out, numbers had been declining year on year before that. This is just Wessex. So that's Wiltshire, Hampshire, Berkshire and Oxfordshire. These are RSPB figures. There's a dip in 2001, which is only because of foot and mouth disease. There are genuine dips though, and so it's not a real dip, it's just people couldn't get out. There are genuine dips in 2013 and 2018 when the early spring was incredibly cold. Remember, 18 was the beast from the east, when there was lots of snow. Stone-curlews arrived back, needed to feed, all they could find was snow, they died. Haven't quite brought the graph up to date, but you can see we've gone from about 50 confirmed breeding pairs to something getting on for 140, and in fact it's now more like 150 or more. So we've managed to treble the population in Wessex, even though the population is now nesting in a much smaller area than it ever did before. So it's a great project. I love being part of it. And you get to hold stone-curlews occasionally. Thank you very much for listening.
That was a fantastic presentation. It's great to see a practical project like that that's achieving results. Are you okay to take some questions?
Absolutely.
Let me kick off with my privilege to ask the first one. It's a bit out on a wing really, but Stone-curlews are migrant species. There have been extralimittal records, I think, in Iceland and quite well north in Scandinavia. Do you think with global warming there is now a prospect of birds finding suitable habitat further north in the UK and for similar work being done? I appreciate the distribution at the moment is largely chalk downland, but former breeding areas.
Well, I think probably climate is not the issue that's restricting them. The thing that's restricting them is the availability of habitat, and in particularly safe habitat. So if you could manage to nudge some of those Norfolk stone-curlews into Lincolnshire by creating plots, and similarly you might be able to work a bit harder on the ones in Oxfordshire and Berkshire, you probably could extend the population. But it's not going to happen fast because the decline happened over 100 years, so you could spend 100 years and get there. I think the difficulty is that funding for this work initially in the 1990s was coming from Europe, plus obviously the RSPB, but they were getting money from the Life Fund. That's now not funding it, and it relies entirely on the RSPB plus external finances, which is why many of us now are volunteers, not RSPB staff. And I don't know that you'd be able to replicate this kind of work in new areas in the hope that it might work.
Yeah.
But if you had a few enthusiasts who wanted to try it and a few farmers who wanted to try it, and Natural England getting the farmers to put plots in, maybe initially for lapwings, you could probably move them bit by bit.
Interesting.
It's a good question though. Yeah, Robert.
Picking up on that question, how integrated is the British population with that in continental Europe? Is there any evidence of ones from Europe breeding in Britain and vice versa?
So the question there was about, is there any kind of interaction between European and British birds? And I'm not aware of any. We've obviously, they all go down and winter together. I guess the Spanish birds that are resident are resident. The other places where they could go into would be France, for example. So the French birds could go back to Britain, but I think they're just programmed to go back to where they came from, and therefore that's why they probably don't spread very much over time.
I was going to say, so any increase in range in Britain is going to depend on the British population?
Absolutely. As I said in the talk, we know to some extent that there is a westerly trend. So birds in Hampshire often go to Wiltshire. It's perhaps why the Sussex population has sort of died out a bit over the years, because if they're all going to go west, then nobody's going west from Kent into Sussex anymore. So therefore, yeah, that population's hanging on by a thread. There's a couple of pairs. Yeah, so if anything, they might go west from Wiltshire. So that you could, for example, look at suitable habitat in counties further west. They used to be in Dorset. There could potentially be the chance of getting them in there. But once they're gone, they've gone. I mean, some of you may remember Martin Down in Western Hampshire, and that's where loads of people went to see Stone-curlew. The female died, or maybe the male died, one of them died, and there was no other Stone-curlews nearby. It didn't get replaced, and eventually in 2008 they stopped nesting. So I think these super strong areas, I can tell you that where I'm working, within 5 miles of my main site, in any direction, I've got 15 pairs nesting. So that's pretty dense.
I think you hit the nail on the head with the comment about increased recreational disturbance as well. Exactly what we're finding with skylarks in the London area.
Sure. Yeah.
Richard. You mentioned that some birds might be starting to winter.
Yeah.
I heard last week that there are some birds wintering south Norfolk on farmland. Does anyone know yet, probably a bit early, but anyone know or guess whether they are family groups or whether they're just adults or whether they're young ones?
I don't. So the question there was about wintering and what do we know about it, and Richard's seen them in Norfolk, or heard of them being in Norfolk. So Chris Knights, who you'll probably know, has been doing a lot of work on them over that way. He has just published a book on the birds. I think he's calling it The Norfolk Plover. It's a privately published book. I'm getting it soon, so hopefully I'll find out what he says about that. But I do know about the ones in Norfolk because I used to go to the BTO quite often, and they had a heath very close by where there were flocks in November, and I believe they stayed into December too. Whether they're family groups, I imagine they would be, because the family group, I think, migrates together. Again, I can't prove a lot of that. I'd love to get some satellite tracks on these birds, but you've got to get them when they're adults. You can't stick it on a young bird at this stage. Maybe in the future you could. And you can't retrap them, so you can't go and put a geolocator on them, because you're never going to meet them again.
Any further questions from the room?
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned when they were kept in captivity, they were fed on pork and bread. You only mentioned one thing in their diet that the wild birds were eating, that was worms. Is that all they eat?
Say again, do they? The last bit.
You mentioned that they eat
Yeah.
worms.
Yeah.
Is that all they eat?
They eat worms and crustaceans, but the thing I tend to notice is I see them pecking around a bit, and therefore they may be taking things, but you see them taking quite large worms out of the ground and then taking it to the chick, and see the poor chick trying to swallow that. Yeah, I mean, strips of pork, I guess you could go out and get worms for them if you wanted to, but given that they were happy to eat pork and bread, that's what they did.
Can I have another one?
Go ahead.
What about predator control? Are you shooting foxes or anything like that?
What are we doing on predator control? It varies across all the farms. So some farms have their own keeper, and the keeper will be controlling predators. They'll be having controls on crows, either shooting them or trapping them. They'll be catching foxes, shooting foxes. Other farms don't. And it's a bit hard to know really what the answer is. There are some places where there are an awful lot of foxes, and you just think these birds haven't got a hope. We've done some work with 5 strings of electric fencing. I'm told by some people you probably don't need anything like as many as 5 strings. You could probably just do 2. That'll keep out the mammalian predators. It's not going to stop your kite or your crow. One of the key things is to always put a plot, if you're creating a plot for the birds, away from fencing and trees, because otherwise they're just perching points for buzzards and crows to watch. And yeah, there's no real guidance about whether to control predators. Probably most farmers I know do to some extent control foxes and things for other reasons, because they've got pheasants they want to rear and they don't want foxes taking them. Yes, Robert.
To what age are stone-curlew young vulnerable to kites and also the buzzards?
Right, what age are they vulnerable? Well, basically, the moment they get out of the egg, they are there and wandering around, but they generally hide under, say, a thistle. So they're vulnerable at that stage if the kite can see them. But I don't know that kites actually do spot many stone-curlew chicks. I've never yet found a stone-curlew chick being killed by a kite. I suspect it happens. They definitely take lapwings, because we put some radio trackers on lapwing chicks, and we then tracked them and found the dead lapwing chick in the kite nest.
Relatively small lapwing chicks?
Not that small, no. I mean, probably a week, 10 days old. So I suppose, yes. I don't think they necessarily are vulnerable to kites the way some people do, but I do know we lose a lot of eggs just at the point where we think they're going to hatch. So I go along and check the eggs, try not to do it too often because I don't want to leave a scent. And then suddenly, the day before we're going to hatch, they're gone. And there's no evidence of them having hatched, because if they do hatch naturally, there's usually some eggshell chick in the nest. I have been to a stone-curlew nest the day before it was going to hatch, and I've heard the stone-curlew babies inside the eggs calling. And I think if you're a fox or a badger, you can hear that too. And also, if you're a fox and badger, you probably don't want to eat an egg that's full of yolk. You'd like to have a nice bit of meat inside. So I wonder if indeed that's the point at which they get detected because of the noise they make. And also when they're just out of the egg, they do make a little cheepy sound because they want the parents to find them from where they wander to.
Fantastic. Keith, thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely great.